My name is Clara. I am 32 years old, and my daily existence revolves around managing the operations of a high-end restaurant group that successfully accommodates 3,000 patrons every single week across 4 bustling locations. In this industry, you learn the mechanics of hospitality inside and out. I know precisely how a check moves from the kitchen expediter to the guest's table with the same innate familiarity that most people have when tying their own shoes. Because of this ingrained professional intuition, when my parents unexpectedly called me after 3 full years of absolute, agonizing silence and extended an invitation to dinner under the guise of making amends, I really should have asked one vital question before agreeing to go. I should have asked, who is really going to be sitting at that table? But I didn't ask. Instead, I blindly drove 40 minutes to an upscale establishment called the Grand Azure, walked through its imposing front doors, and discovered 16 members of my estranged family already comfortably seated around a massive, elongated table. This table was lavishly covered in extravagant seafood like lobster tails, premium Wagyu steaks, and a decadent $400 bottle of Bordeaux wine that they had already begun pouring long before I had even pulled my car into the restaurant's parking lot. My father looked up from his commanding position at the head of the table, flashed a calculated smile, and uttered the exact words that I had spent my entire life working to overcome. "You're paying, right? You owe us that much," he demanded, fully believing that he had perfectly cornered me in front of an audience. However, what he absolutely hadn't counted on were the 2 quiet sentences I was preparing to whisper to our waiter, nor was he prepared for the brutal reality that his very own credit card was about to broadcast to our entire family just 15 minutes later. This is a story for anyone who has ever been unfairly expected to foot the bill, to constantly fix others' mistakes, or to remain silent to keep the peace. To truly understand the gravity of that night, I need to back up a few weeks to the morning the fateful invitation arrived. Long before I saw that parking lot full of familiar vehicles, and long before my father attempted to ambush me with a dining bill roughly the size of a monthly mortgage payment, you need to understand who I was. You must know the version of me they were calculatingly counting on, which was a version I had firmly stopped being years ago. I am the manager of 4 busy restaurants. I do not own them. I manage them. Having built my career from the absolute bottom, starting as a teenager bussing tables at a smoky steakhouse in Seattle when I was just 17, waking up for the school bus the next morning still reeking of stale fryer oil. I worked my way up the exhausting ladder, hostess at 19, a full server at 21, a dedicated floor manager by 24, and finally the regional operations director by the time I turned 30. Despite my title, I am not wealthy. I own a modest, paid-off 2-bedroom condo, maintain a retirement account that I absolutely never touch, and allow myself exactly one simple indulgence in life: sparkling water. Whether still or sparkling, it is the only beverage I ever order when I eat out, every single time, which my staff affectionately dismisses as a strange personal quirk. But it isn't a quirk at all. When you spend your formative years constantly paying for everyone else's expensive steaks, you develop a deep-seated survival instinct to keep your own tab small enough that you can easily walk away from it. On the specific morning the invitation arrived, I was sitting in my office meticulously reviewing a complex vendor contract for imported olive oil, entirely absorbed in the kind of mundane Tuesday tasks that make you forget not everyone's life is strictly governed by inventory pars and spreadsheets. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the desk, and as I glanced down at the screen, a distinct, icy chill settled deep behind my ribs. After 3 long years of utter silence, a notification flashed from the family group chat, a chat I had been unceremoniously removed from on the exact day I was designated as the family's primary villain. The family had unexpectedly added me back into the circle, and I simply stared at that glowing notification for a full minute, paralyzed, before I finally found the courage to open it. The chat was titled with a little red heart emoji that my mother had originally selected 6 years prior when she first created the group. Back in a simpler time when it was innocently used for sharing mundane Thanksgiving recipes and cute photos of my sister Chloe's dog. I had not laid eyes on that red heart in 3 years, and the chat history was completely wiped clean, displaying absolutely nothing above my mother's newest incoming message. This deliberate emptiness meant they had either intentionally cleared the entire history, or much more likely, they had simply maintained a secondary, secret group chat without me for the duration of my exile. My mother's digital message was remarkably warm, highly careful, and felt almost painfully rehearsed. She claimed that she and my dad had been doing a significant amount of deep reflecting recently, and that they desperately wanted to invite me out to a nice dinner at the Grand Azure in order to finally start healing our fractured family. She explicitly wrote that it would be just the 4 of us, her, my dad, me, and my sister Chloe, framing it as an intimate, small dinner meant to symbolize a fresh start. However, a mere 30 seconds later, a second message chimed in, containing a specific, triggering phrase that should have immediately revealed their true intentions. She wrote, "Family takes care of family, sweetheart. It's time we remembered that." That exact phrase, "family takes care of family," was heavily loaded with historical baggage. She used to recite that line to me when I was a struggling 19-year-old, and she desperately needed to confiscate my hard-earned server tips just to keep the electric bill paid. She recited it again when I was 23, and my father suddenly needed a reliable cosigner to secure a loan for his truck. She weaponized it yet again when Chloe's very first apartment lease unexpectedly fell through, heavily pressuring me until I quietly stepped in and paid her expensive security deposit. In our toxic household, the phrase "family takes care of family" had always secretly translated to one very specific reality: Clara takes care of the family. I read her loaded message twice, acutely noticing that my mother had noticeably omitted the words "sorry" or "we were wrong," instead actively choosing the passive, non-committal phrase, "it was time to heal." It was a masterpiece of passive voice, completely lacking a subject and absolving everyone of any direct responsibility for the past 3 years of pain. Despite every alarm bell ringing in my head, I quickly typed back, "I'll be there," before aggressively placing my phone face down on the desk. I forced my attention back to the olive oil contract, desperately pretending that my hands weren't trembling. The catastrophic rift in our family had originated 3 years ago when my younger sister Chloe suddenly decided she was going to open an artisanal cafe. She possessed absolutely no formal business plan and had conducted 0 market studies. Her entire motivation stemmed from seeing a trendy cafe in Portland boasting exposed brick walls and a natural organic menu, which arrogantly led her to conclude, "I could do that." At the time, she was 26 years old, had never so much as managed a children's lemonade stand, and yet she inexplicably required a staggering $75,000 small business loan to fund this naive dream. Miraculously, the bank agreed to approve the massive loan, but with one major non-negotiable stipulation: she needed a financially stable cosigner. By their calculated logic, that cosigner was obviously supposed to be me. My mother called me on a tense Sunday, while my dad sat right beside her, his arms defensively folded, already radiating intense anger, before I had even answered the call. They insisted Chloe desperately needed the loan because the cafe was her ultimate dream, completely ignoring the sheer financial peril involved. Their justification was incredibly simple. I had excellent credit, a highly stable career, and a long, predictable history of always saying yes to their demands. "Just sign the papers, Clara," they ordered. Attempting to inject some professional rationality into the emotional frenzy, I calmly asked to review her business plan first, only to discover that Chloe didn't actually have one. When I gently pressed her for critical details regarding her projected profit margins, the specific terms of her commercial lease, or any established supplier contracts, Chloe just stared back at me with deep offense, acting as though I had viciously insulted her personal cooking skills. The atmosphere turned instantly hostile. My mother's voice went completely flat and cold as she delivered the ultimate guilt trip. "She's your sister. You don't need a spreadsheet to love your sister." Knowing the severe consequences, I firmly said no. My refusal wasn't born out of a lack of love for Chloe, because I genuinely did love her. However, having spent my entire adult life grinding in the notoriously brutal restaurant industry, I had witnessed far too many naive people pour their entire life savings into flawed concepts lacking any real operational foundation. I intimately knew the crushing reality of what $75,000 of someone else's compounding debt truly feels like at 3 a.m, when the cafe is completely dark, failing, and the massive loan payment is still inevitably due. Upon hearing my refusal, my dad aggressively stood up, pointed a furious finger toward the door, and spat the devastating words that would permanently close our relationship for the next 3 years. He declared, "If you won't help this family, you're not part of it." I immediately drove home that day in shock, and by the very next morning, I had been swiftly and maliciously removed from the family group chat. Absolutely nobody called me to check in. Nobody sent so much as a single text message. For 3 painfully long years, the prevailing narrative was that I was the cold, unfeeling daughter who fiercely loved her own money far more than she loved her own flesh and blood sister. The hardest part for me to admit, even now, is that the ensuing silence almost completely broke me emotionally. I wasn't devastated because I believed they were right. I knew in my bones that they were financially and morally wrong, but rather because deep down I profoundly missed being needed by them. That desperate need to be useful was the true festering wound in my psyche. It ultimately took me 2 grueling years of deep introspection and the steady guidance of a brilliant therapist named Dr. Eris to accurately identify and name that toxic dynamic. I had been conditioned to act as the ultimate family fixer since the tender age of 17, when my very first restaurant paycheck was immediately diverted to buy the family's groceries. My annual tax refunds were routinely handed over to fund my mother's expensive dental work. When my father's car transmission dramatically blew out, I secretly paid for the complete rebuild out of my own pocket, carefully lying to him that the massive repair was somehow covered under an expired warranty. I lied because I deeply knew his fragile ego would never allow him to openly accept a charitable handout from his 22-year-old daughter. When Chloe eventually got married, I quietly covered the astronomical bills for the florist, the professional photographer, and fully half of the extravagant reception costs. I sat there and forced a polite smile while my mother gave a tearful, glowing toast to the room about successfully raising 2 strong girls. Yes, we were 2 strong girls, but I was the only one footing the massive bill. I didn't perform these financial rescues because I was an inherently selfless, generous saint. I did it because, somewhere around the impressionable age of 15, I had internalized the toxic lesson that the absolute fastest, most efficient way to maintain fragile peace in my chaotic family was to proactively ensure that nobody ever had to ask me for money twice. The established cycle was brutally simple. They ask once, Clara quietly pays the bill, everyone remains happy, and the family dinner remains blissfully quiet. Over the years, I had successfully trained them to view me this way. I had inadvertently taught my demanding parents that my personal wallet was nothing more than a convenient, endless vending machine. Simply insert a modicum of emotional guilt and immediately receive a blank check in return. Predictably, when that exhausted machine finally flashed an out-of-order sign regarding the cafe loan, they didn't bother trying to troubleshoot the underlying mechanical issues or fix the relationship. They simply unplugged me from their lives and coldly walked away. So, when my mother's manipulative message suddenly popped up on my screen after 3 years of total abandonment, sweetly purring, "Family takes care of family, sweetheart," I acutely felt the old, deeply ingrained reflex aggressively fire in my chest, responding like a dormant, atrophied muscle I hadn't stretched in years. My broken inner child screamed at me to just go, to fix the lingering tension, to blindly pay whatever steep financial cost was required just to make the painful silence go away. But simultaneously, cutting through the panic, I distinctly heard Dr. Aris's calm, rational voice echoing in my mind, as steady and predictable as a metronome. She had repeatedly reminded me during our sessions, "You taught them you would always pay. That was your mistake to fix. Not by paying more, but by stopping." The day after I received the ominous dinner invitation, I confided in my closest coworker, Sarah, while we sat across from each other at lunch. Sarah practically begged me not to go, warning me with absolute certainty, "Clara, this has ambush written all over it." I vividly remember laughing at her dire warning, finding it darkly ironic that Sarah, who had never even met a single member of my toxic family, could instantly see the obvious trap far clearer than I was allowing myself to. My sharp sous chef, Julian, echoed her exact sentiments, though much shorter, simply stating, "Don't." Despite their unified protests, my mind was already decisively made up, though not because I foolishly believed their warnings were wrong, nor because I naively expected my parents to deliver a heartfelt apology. I desperately wanted to sit directly across from my estranged parents and tangibly find out whether 3 years of agonizing separation had actually changed anything about their core character, or whether the prolonged silence had simply been a cruel, extended version of the exact same transactional conversation we had always engaged in. I needed to know if it was still a dynamic where my only valuable role was to passively listen, blindly agree, and ultimately pay. I fiercely craved absolute closure, even if attaining that closure meant horrifyingly confirming that the door to my family was permanently nailed shut. There was also something else driving me, something profound that is exceptionally hard to publicly admit. But I strive to be brutally honest because I know some people out there will intimately understand the painful complexity of familial grief. Despite everything they had done, I deeply missed my mother. I didn't miss the cold, calculating mother who masterfully orchestrated financial guilt trips, nor did I miss the petty woman who constantly kept an invisible score of perceived slights. I missed the warm, nurturing version of her who had patiently taught a 9-year-old me how to bake golden cornbread in a heavy cast iron skillet, joyfully singing along to vintage country music at the top of her lungs while the yellow butter slowly melted on the stove. That specific, loving mother hadn't called me in 3 years either, but on my loneliest nights I could still clearly hear the faint echoes of that country music in my memories. So I stubbornly told Sarah that I was firmly committed to going. I confidently assured Julian that I would be perfectly fine. I repeatedly told myself the exact same reassuring lie and managed to almost genuinely believe it. To protect myself, I established one strict non-negotiable internal rule for the evening. One single dinner, Keep it perfectly civil, and absolutely no exchanging of money under any circumstances. If the atmosphere started to feel even remotely wrong or manipulative, I promised myself I would immediately stand up and leave before the dessert course was even ordered. To ensure I wouldn't waver, I physically wrote this golden rule down on a bright sticky note and firmly pressed it to the center of my car's steering wheel on the frantic morning of the scheduled dinner. One dinner, then home, it plainly read. That very same crinkled sticky note was still staring back at me when I finally pulled my car into the Grand Azure's meticulously manicured parking lot and began anxiously counting the surrounding cars. I had deliberately chosen to dress incredibly simple for the occasion. I wore basic black slacks, a modest gray blouse that I typically reserve for boring corporate vendor meetings, and sensible flat shoes. I wore absolutely no flashy jewelry, with the sole exception of a small understated silver watch that I had proudly purchased for myself the very year I was promoted to regional director. I didn't wear it because I harbored any desperate desire to impress my critical family, but simply because I had genuinely earned it through blood and sweat. It reliably kept excellent time, and for me, that quiet competency felt like more than enough. I adamantly did not want to walk into the opulent lobby of the Grand Azure looking like I was intentionally putting on a wealthy performance. My resentful family already firmly believed that I aggressively flaunted my professional success just to spite them. The unglamorous truth was that I still drove a reliable but aging 9-year-old Honda sedan and diligently meal prepped my lunches on quiet Sunday afternoons, exactly like half of the working class population of America. The tense drive to the restaurant took exactly 40 minutes. I intentionally played no music on the radio, needing total silence to focus, keeping my white-knuckled hands rigidly locked at the 10 and 2 o'clock positions on the steering wheel. Somewhere right around the hectic highway merge, my anxious stomach began to violently tighten in a dreadfully familiar, sickening way. It was the exact same visceral, plunging feeling of impending doom that I routinely get at work when a massive walk-in cooler catastrophically fails on a busy Friday night, signaling that the next 6 hours of my life are going to hurt tremendously. It was pure, unfiltered instinct. My physical body inherently knew a dark truth that my rational brain was still desperately trying to negotiate away. I came incredibly close to aborting the mission and turning the car around right at the highway exit ramp. I almost gave up. But then I thought about that warm cast iron cornbread, and I intensely focused on Dr. Aris's steady, grounding voice in my head, and I stubbornly forced myself to keep driving toward the danger. The Grand Azure was imposingly situated at the far end of an affluent strip of luxury shops that I hadn't stepped foot near in years. It was located on the notably expensive side of town, the specific kind of upscale establishment where the sprawling parking lot is immaculately landscaped and the intimidating hostesses are strictly mandated to wear all black. Scanning the lot, I immediately spotted my dad's familiar truck parked aggressively in the third row, with my mom's aging sedan parked right next to it. Fine, I muttered to myself. But then my eyes nervously darted down the row, and I saw Aunt Martha's distinct white Buick. My heart rate spiked as I then identified Uncle Robert's oversized SUV. A moment later, I recognized Chloe's messy hatchback, still sporting the peeling, faded bumper sticker, aggressively promoting the failed cafe that had devastatingly closed its doors a mere 11 months after it boldly opened. I continued scanning and quickly identified 3 more vehicles belonging to distant relatives I recognized, along with 2 completely unfamiliar cars. My stomach horrifyingly dropped into my shoes before my hand had even touched the car door handle. Just the 4 of us, my mother had explicitly written in her message. Yet, sitting in my car, I meticulously counted 9 separate vehicles directly tied to my family. I remained frozen in my Honda for 2 full agonizing minutes, the engine completely shut off, my trembling hands death gripping the steering wheel, while my eyes frantically reread the crumpled sticky note. One dinner, then home. The safest, most logical action would have been to immediately throw the car into reverse, speed out of the expensive lot, and drive the 40 minutes back to the safety of my quiet condo. I could have peacefully eaten leftover soup in my pajamas and successfully avoided ever thinking about this massive family reunion that I clearly hadn't been honestly invited to. Or, more accurately, a reunion I apparently had been invited to without being afforded the basic respect of knowing the actual guest list. But despite the screaming red flags, I forced myself to get out of the car. I nervously straightened the collar of my modest blouse, firmly locked the car doors, and bravely began the long walk toward the looming entrance. I did this because I was a 32-year-old professional who had spent 3 grueling years intensely learning in therapy how not to constantly run away from my problems, and I absolutely was not going to start running again in a superficial restaurant parking lot on a random Thursday evening. The imposing front doors of the Grand Azure were crafted from heavy, thick glass adorned with massive polished brass handles, specifically designed to be the kind of opulent doors that silently whisper to approaching guests. Entrees here start at $42 before you even get a chance to see a menu. Stepping inside, the dimly lit lobby smelled intoxicatingly of fresh rosemary, warm artisan bread, and old money. A polished hostess wearing a sleek black dress offered a practiced, hollow smile as she consulted her glowing screen. "Sterling party?" she inquired. I gave a curt nod. She nodded back, her expression slightly tight. "Your party is already seated," she informed me. She delivered this news with the specific clipped tone that hostesses naturally adopt when they have been exhaustingly dealing with an overly demanding, obnoxiously large group for over an hour and are trying incredibly hard not to look visibly stressed. Having spent years on the floor, I intimately recognized that exact strained expression. I had personally worn it 1,000 times during my own brutal shifts. Without another word, she quickly grabbed a menu, just one single menu, and began to lead me deep toward the back of the expansive dining room. I could hear my family long before I could actually see them. The raucous sounds of booming laughter and the sharp clinking of heavy crystal glasses echoed down the corridor. Aunt Martha's unmistakable, piercing cackle brutally cut through the polite, low murmur of every other sophisticated table in the entire establishment. "One dinner, then home," I silently chanted to myself like a protective mantra. I rounded the final corner and finally laid eyes on the spectacle. The table was massive, boasting 16 chairs, with every single one of them completely filled, except for the one glaringly empty seat strategically positioned at the absolute far end, directly across the long expanse from my father. The imposing table aggressively stretched the entire length of the restaurant's private dining alcove. It was dressed in pristine white linen, set with heavy, expensive silverware, and illuminated by flickering candles housed in low, expensive crystal holders. Even from 10 feet away, my trained eyes instantly calculated the staggering cost of the culinary spread. There were towering platters of massive lobster tails fanned out majestically across beds of crushed ice. There were dozens of premium Wagyu beef sliders proudly displayed on an elaborate tiered silver stand. There was a sprawling artisan charcuterie board, roughly the size of a small coffee table. And sitting dominantly in the absolute center of the feast was a distinctive bottle of wine I immediately recognized from high-end corporate vendor tastings. It was a vintage 2016 Saint-Emilion Grand Cru, a bottle that retails for around $400, and it was already half completely empty. They had obviously been sitting here for quite a while, and they had been ordering with reckless, aggressive abandon. The hostess paused tentatively at the edge of the alcove, shooting me a deeply sympathetic look that translates universally across every single restaurant I have ever worked in. A look that simply meant, good luck. Before stepping away, she leaned in closer and quietly whispered a critical piece of operational intelligence. Your father put a card down to firmly hold the reservation, just so you know. We strictly require one for parties over 12. I mentally filed away that crucial sentence in my brain the exact same way I professionally file away every single operational detail, silently, completely, and permanently. His credit card was technically on file. He was the one who had financially secured the large table. And yet, despite that fact, I somehow intuitively knew deep in my bones that the astronomical final bill was never actually supposed to land on his shoulders. My mother was the very first person to spot my arrival. She immediately stood up, throwing both of her arms wide open in a theatrical display of affection, causing every single head at the massive table to eagerly turn in my direction. "Clara! Oh, sweetheart! Just look at you!" she loudly exclaimed. Suddenly, to my absolute horror, the entire table erupted into applause. It was actual, literal applause, as though I were a heroic returning soldier marching home from a grueling war, rather than the discarded daughter they had callously ghosted for 1,000 lonely days. Uncle Robert let out a piercing, celebratory whistle. Aunt Martha dramatically dabbed at her dry eyes with a pristine cloth napkin, feigning overwhelming emotion. Chloe simply sat there, casually raising her expensive wine glass toward me, offering a chilling smile that showed all of her teeth but absolutely none of her warmth. I surveyed the ridiculous scene. 16 demanding people devouring mountains of lobster and premium Wagyu beef, heavily washing it down with a $400 bottle of exclusive Bordeaux. Just the 4 of us, my mother had blatantly lied in her message. Numbly, I walked over and sat down. Really? What else are you supposed to logically do when 16 sets of expectant eyes are intensely watching your every move, your designated chair is already expectantly pulled out, and a frantic waiter is actively pouring ice water into your crystal glass before your purse has even touched the floor? I sat down, and I plastered a serene smile on my face, because that is exactly what 15 grueling years of intensive front-of-house hospitality training beats into you. The uncanny ability to maintain a perfectly pleasant smile while your internal brain is simultaneously running a full-scale, high-speed threat assessment of the entire room. My mother happily settled back into her plush seat, positively beaming with manufactured joy. "We just wanted it to be a massive surprise," she gushed. "The whole family finally back together, just like the good old times." Keeping my voice perfectly level, I calmly replied, "I thought it was just the 4 of us." My mother dismissively waved her manicured hand in the air, batting away my valid concern exactly like she was aggressively swatting a pesky fly. "Well," she dramatically sighed, "once Martha heard about the dinner, and then Robert found out, and then your cousin Beatrice caught wind of it. It just organically grew. You know exactly how family is." I stared blankly back at her. Oh, I knew exactly how our family was. I systematically scanned the faces around the table, mentally cataloging the ambush. My dad sat regally at the head of the table, enthusiastically carving into a delicate Wagyu slider with the aggressive enthusiasm of a man carving a massive Thanksgiving turkey. Chloe was slouched to his immediate left, tightly clutching her smartphone in one hand, while expertly balancing her wine glass in the other, obsessively scrolling through some social media feed I couldn't see, barely registering my physical presence. Aunt Martha and Uncle Robert heavily anchored the middle section of the table, loudly holding court. The remaining seats were filled with distant cousins I literally hadn't spoken a single word to since a disastrous Thanksgiving argument 5 long years ago. There was Simon, Beatrice, Leo, 2 random wives whose names I had instantly forgotten after meeting them only once, and inexplicably, Aunt Martha's random neighbor, a complete stranger to me, who was currently gorging herself on my family's special occasion lobster. The expensive wine was aggressively flowing, and the massive food platters were already half demolished. It was painfully obvious that they had been camped out at this table for at least a full hour prior to my arrival, and they had ruthlessly ordered absolutely everything on the menu that didn't literally require taking out a second mortgage to afford. My mother leaned across the linen tablecloth and tightly squeezed my cold hand. "See?" she cooed softly. "Family takes care of family." There it was again. Those same 5 manipulative words, expertly delivered in the exact same deceptively warm packaging, precisely aimed at the exact same vulnerable target. I reflexively squeezed her hand back, but offered absolutely nothing in return. I said nothing. Instead, my brain was rapidly doing the horrific math, mentally counting the expensive plates piled on the table. My father is the specific kind of domineering man who forcefully orders food for the entire table. He never asks what anyone wants. He simply commands the room and orders. Suddenly, he arrogantly waved the exhausted waiter over. The young server, a pale kid who looked like he was barely out of his teens and running entirely on sheer anxiety and cheap caffeine, rushed over. Without even bothering to glance at a physical menu, my dad forcefully rattled off massive additions to their already staggering feast. "Bring us another huge round of those lobster tails," he commanded. "2 more of those Wagyu beef plates, and go ahead and bring another bottle of that Bordeaux, the Grand Cru. Make sure it's the good one." He made sure to loudly emphasize the words, "the good one," booming his voice loud enough to aggressively ensure that the wealthy patrons sitting at the tables on either side of our party could clearly hear his flex. To complete the arrogant performance, my dad whipped out his credit card from his worn leather wallet, proudly holding the plastic high in the air between 2 fingers, displaying it exactly like a cheap street magician, enthusiastically showing his captive audience a silver coin right before performing a magic trick. "Put every single bit of it on this," he loudly instructed the young waiter, gesturing grandly to the table. "We are really celebrating tonight." The terrified waiter, whose crooked name tag plainly read Liam, frantically scribbled the massive order onto his notepad, nodded profusely, and quickly disappeared into the chaotic depths toward the kitchen, desperately wearing the haggard look of a young man who brutally needed a smoke break. I silently watched my father smugly tuck the credit card back into the folds of his wallet, giving it a self-satisfied little pat, exactly the way one might affectionately pat a well-trained dog that has just successfully performed a neat trick. But my finely tuned instincts were screaming. Something was fundamentally off about his entire display. I had grown up in a house watching this exact man bitterly argue with terrified mechanics over the minor price of a standard car muffler. I had personally watched him belligerently demand to return a cheap shirt to a department store simply because a minor sale tag was missing. Arthur Sterling was absolutely not a man who casually ordered $400 bottles of wine on a whim. He certainly did not proudly wave his credit cards around like victorious flags. This entire exaggerated display was a meticulously choreographed performance, and it was entirely, strategically aimed at manipulating me. The silent, aggressive subtext of his actions screamed, "Look at how incredibly well we're doing without you, Clara. Look at how little we ever really needed you." Except the fragile illusion was full of gaping holes. The vehicle sitting out in the parking lot was the exact same aging truck he had driven 5 years ago, still sporting the prominent, ugly dent in the rear quarter panel that he claimed he could never afford to fix. And sitting right on the empty chair beside my mother was her beloved handbag, an old, faded designer purse she had religiously carried since I was a mere high school student, its severely cracked leather strap currently being held together by a desperate, cheap safety pin. Yes, they were heavily performing for my benefit, completely masking their reality. I just didn't know exactly how high the cruel price of admission to this tragic theater was going to be yet. The insidious small verbal cuts began to land right around the time the second bottle of Bordeaux was aggressively popped open. Aunt Martha leaned heavily across Uncle Robert's plate, fixing me with a calculating stare, and loudly remarked, "Well, it certainly must be nice running all those fancy, expensive restaurants while the poor rest of us are stuck sitting at home, clipping grocery coupons just to survive." She let out a sharp, grating laugh as she delivered the insult, the specific, passive-aggressive way toxic people laugh when they desperately want you to know they are entirely serious, but are hiding behind the guise of a casual joke. Not missing a beat, Cousin Beatrice innocently fluttered her eyelashes and asked if I ever felt terrible guilt living such a lavish, comfortable lifestyle, while my poor parents were currently suffering through such a severely rough patch. I froze. I literally knew absolutely nothing about any rough patch. Not a single person in this family had bothered to tell me anything about a rough patch over the past 3 years. Chloe, utterly refusing to even look up from the glowing screen of her smartphone, viciously chimed in to twist the knife. "Oh, she wouldn't know anything about that. She hasn't been around to care." Every single biting comment landed with the chilling, flawless precision of something heavily rehearsed. It wasn't exactly a formally scripted play, but their attacks were deeply aligned, moving together seamlessly like a practiced choir, perfectly finding the same exact note without needing a conductor to guide them. It became instantly clear that for the past 3 years, they had spent countless hours bitterly talking about me. They had endlessly discussed my physical absence, my presumed wealth, and my perceived selfishness. And they had all collectively arrived at this restaurant tonight, operating under a singular, shared understanding of the family narrative. Clara coldly left us. Clara has plenty of money. Therefore, Clara owes us. Aunt Martha was the one who finally delivered the family's core thesis statement. She reached her hand across the cluttered table, firmly grabbing my cold hand as though she were tragically comforting a grieving widow at a gloomy funeral, and patronizingly said, "Family doesn't keep score, dear." I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper to keep from laughing out loud. Family doesn't keep score? This brazen lecture was coming directly from a petty woman who had once vindictively refused to speak to her very own daughter-in-law for 6 agonizing months, simply over a perceived slight regarding a minor seating arrangement at a Thanksgiving dinner. I managed to suppress my bitter laughter. Instead, I gently but firmly pulled my hand away from her invasive grasp and quietly picked up my crystal glass. It contained nothing but sparkling water. It was the absolute only item currently sitting in front of me, and it was the singular, solitary thing I had actually ordered since arriving. The visual contrast was jarring and almost morbidly funny. 16 loud, demanding people aggressively swimming in piles of rich lobster shells and drowning in expensive Bordeaux. And then just me, sitting silently at the absolute far end of the massive table, nursing a solitary glass of basic sparkling water, looking exactly like the miserable designated driver trapped at a raucous bachelor party. Liam, the painfully young and visibly stressed waiter, quietly passed behind my chair, and I managed to briefly catch his panicked eye. "Just the water tonight?" he whispered quickly, his tone carrying a note of genuine surprise. "Just the water," I whispered back firmly. He gave a small, perceptive nod, his eyes lingering on my face for a split second, as though he inherently understood a much deeper truth that I hadn't dared to speak out loud. Let me take a moment to tell you exactly about Liam. He looked to be maybe 19 or 20 years old at most, built painfully thin in that very specific, wiry way that young restaurant kids are, before they eventually learn the survival skill of inhaling heavy food while hiding in the kitchen between chaotic dinner rushes. He moved across the dining floor incredibly fast, yet excessively careful, telegraphing the distinct, terrified body language of a totally green server who realizes that the assigned table is way too large. The aggressive food order is way too complicated, and that dropping even one single expensive plate inevitably means suffering a brutal conversation with a ruthless manager that he simply cannot financially afford. I profoundly recognized absolutely everything about this kid's frantic energy because, a lifetime ago, I had been him. I vividly remembered being 17 years old, completely buried under the weeds, deeply in the terrifying weeds of two massive tables, painfully learning the harsh industry truth that the entitled guests who rudely snap their fingers in your face are always the exact same guests who leave the absolute worst tips. Against all reasonable restaurant logistics, this poor kid was practically handling our monstrous 16-top table entirely alone. Well, almost entirely alone. A silent, ghostly busser would occasionally appear out of nowhere to rapidly clear away the towering stacks of dirty plates. But it was Liam who was frantically running every single complicated food order, managing every single demanding drink refill, and politely absorbing every single aggressive, "Excuse me, can we get more butter?" specifically barked by Aunt Martha, who had already rudely demanded extra butter 3 separate times in the span of just 20 minutes. Despite the abuse, Liam never once complained out loud. He never even let out an exasperated sigh. He silently refilled my glass of sparkling water without me ever having to ask, and when he gently set the dewy glass back down on the linen, he briefly caught me staring down the length of the chaotic table with a deeply cynical, exhausted expression that I probably should have tried much harder to hide from the staff. "Long night?" he murmured sympathetically under his breath as he poured. I was so incredibly tempted to just dump the entire ugly truth on him right then and there. Instead, I offered him a small, genuine smile and simply whispered, "You're doing great." He physically blinked, looking genuinely startled by the basic kindness, as though he had completely forgotten that paying customers were even legally allowed to say nice things to the help. Then, visibly emboldened, he miraculously straightened up his tired posture, standing about half an inch taller, and bravely moved on to tackle Uncle Robert's demanding refill request. I silently watched Liam scurry away and felt a deep pang of nostalgia as I thought about the younger, more fragile version of myself. I thought about the desperate girl who used to dangerously balance 4 scorching hot plates up her scarred forearm. The girl who used to routinely lock herself inside the freezing walk-in freezer just to violently sob in private on the exceptionally hard, soul-crushing nights. That young, naive girl had absolutely no idea that she would eventually end up sitting on the opposite side of a luxury table exactly like this one, trapped sitting directly across from the very toxic family that had systematically manipulated her into becoming a compulsive fixer and an endless ATM. She had no idea she would find herself silently being asked, without actually being asked directly, to reluctantly write one more massive peacekeeping check. But looking back, I knew that younger version of me would completely, fundamentally understand exactly what I was fiercely preparing to do next. She would understand the brutal necessity of it perfectly. Right around the torturous 40-minute mark of the dinner, I politely excused myself from the table to visit the restroom. In truth, I desperately needed 2 solid minutes of absolute silence, free from Aunt Martha's endless grating commentary, and I desperately craved the security of a heavy wooden door that I could physically lock behind me. The Grand Ajour's restroom was incredibly lavish. It was the specific kind of upscale facility stocked with thick rolled cloth hand towels, artisanal lavender-scented soap, and wildly flattering full-length lighting that miraculously made you look slightly better than you currently felt. This was honestly an impressive architectural trick, considering that my stomach was aggressively churning, and I currently felt like I was slowly digesting broken shards of glass. I forcefully pushed up my sleeves, turned on the designer brass faucet, and firmly pressed the freezing cold water directly against the erratic pulse points on my wrists. It's an old trick you quickly learn when you desperately need your racing heart rate to suddenly cooperate with your logical brain during a panic attack. As I stood there taking shaky breaths, I suddenly saw it. Sitting precariously on the absolute edge of the pristine marble countertop was a smartphone, its screen glaringly still lit up, protected by a distinct, childish phone case heavily covered in bright yellow daisy stickers. It was Chloe's phone. She must have slipped into the restroom right before I did and carelessly left it behind on the slick marble when she inevitably got distracted by something shiny. Leaving important things scattered everywhere was classic Chloe behavior. Sadly, chronic forgetfulness was one of the very few human traits the two of us actually shared. Now, I need to be perfectly clear about this. I absolutely did not walk into that restroom with any devious plan to snoop through her private device. I want to be entirely clear on my moral stance regarding that. But the glowing screen was incredibly bright against the dim ambiance of the bathroom, and the massive notification banner glaring at the top of her locked screen proudly displayed a message from a private family group chat that I had conspicuously never been added to. The brief snippet of preview text flashing on the screen was violently shocking enough to instantly stop my wet hand mid-reach as I lunged for a dry paper towel. The secret group chat was bluntly titled Dinner Plan, and it contained exactly 3 members, Mom, Dad, and Chloe. The latest unread message, time-stamped from exactly 4 days ago, was sent directly from Mom. The tiny preview window displayed a string of chilling words that burned themselves into my retinas, words I can still recite perfectly from memory. It read, "Don't tell Clara, it's everyone. She won't dare." The cruel message frustratingly cut off right at the physical edge of the notification banner. Suddenly, the panic vanished. My racing pulse became eerily, deathly steady. I thoroughly dried my trembling hands, and then I purposefully picked up her glowing phone. I picked it up with the exact same cold, detached precision that I would use to pick up a fraudulent vendor invoice that blatantly didn't add up. I wasn't blindingly angry. I wasn't even genuinely surprised. I was simply calmly confirming the ugly truth that the emotional numbers had already strongly suggested to me. I bypassed the lock screen. Chloe always used her own birthday, a terrible security habit I had warned her about years ago, and scrolled aggressively up the chat history. The full, horrifying text of Mom's message read, "Don't tell Clara, it's everyone. Once she's there with the whole family watching, she won't dare say no. She never could handle a scene." Just below that vile strategy, Dad had coldly replied, "Just make sure she sits at my end. I'll handle the ask." And then there was Chloe's sickening contribution, gleefully time-stamped a mere 2 minutes later. "Order the good stuff before she gets there. Once it's on the table, she can't exactly send it back. LOL." The sheer malice of the LOL made my stomach violently flip. I kept scrolling higher, absorbing 3 agonizing weeks of their covert manipulative planning. There was Mom frantically coordinating the secret RSVPs. Martha is in, Robert is in. Beatrice says she'll say yes if we promise there's expensive wine. There was Dad, acting much quieter but entirely logistical, obsessively discussing the restaurant's parking situation, the strict reservation time, and meticulously workshopping exactly how Mom should carefully frame the initial trap invitation so that it deceptively sounded casual and innocent. And then I hit the older messages, the ones that turned the warm blood in my stomach entirely to ice. A frantic message from Mom, dated exactly 10 days ago. "The bank called again on Thursday. We need to figure out something before June." Dad's immediate callous response, "Clara can cover us through the spring. She's got more than enough." And finally, the ultimate betrayal, the message that violently hit my chest like a heavy sack of wet gravel, dropped directly from a high shelf. It was Mom again, from 8 days ago. It's not asking for money. It's letting her back into the family. She should be grateful we're even giving her this chance. Grateful? The utter audacity of the word echoed in the tiled room. They fully, genuinely expected me to fall to my knees and be deeply grateful. They wanted me to be profusely thankful for the rare, bestowed privilege of being maliciously tricked into attending a 16-person circus dinner at an overly pretentious restaurant I absolutely never would have picked for myself, all so I could be ambushed into paying a massive bill I explicitly didn't order. They expected me to blindly fund a solution to a massive, secretive financial crisis that absolutely nobody had bothered to tell me about, to save a toxic family that had ruthlessly cut me off and discarded me the very last time I had bravely dared to say the word no. My hands didn't shake as I very carefully set Chloe's phone back down on the cold marble counter, placing it face down in the exact, precise location where I had originally found it. I methodically washed my hands a second time, scrubbing them raw. I slowly looked up and met my own furious gaze in that flattering, expensive mirror. I stared directly into my own eyes and firmly thought, I know exactly what you are doing. I know exactly what this twisted game costs. And for the very first time in 15 years, I am absolutely not going to pay the toll. Standing there alone in that lavish bathroom, physically holding the heavy, unvarnished truth in both of my hands, the strangest realization washed over me. It was marvelously bizarre how incredibly calm I suddenly felt. I wasn't emotionally numb, nor was I blindingly angry anymore. I felt terrifyingly crystal clear. It was the exact beautiful clarity of a chaotic commercial kitchen suddenly going dead quiet right before the absolute chaos of a massive dinner rush hits. Everything in my mind was perfectly in position. No useless emotional energy was being wasted, and every mental station was fully prepped and ready for war. If you have ever experienced the profound, devastating heartbreak of discovering that you were only ever loved conditionally for exactly what resources you could provide, rather than for who you fundamentally are as a human being, then you intimately know exactly how freezing cold that fancy tile floor felt under my flat shoes at that exact moment. What I meticulously planned to do next, I calculated entirely within the brief span of time it takes to dry your hands under an airdryer. I marched back out to the chaotic dining room and approached the massive table wearing the exact same stoic, unreadable expression I typically deploy when a ruthless city health inspector unexpectedly arrives unannounced during a Friday dinner rush. I was pleasant, entirely unreadable, and strictly dangerously operational. As I sat down, absolutely nobody noticed any shift in my demeanor. Aunt Martha was loudly dominating the conversation, enthusiastically telling a wildly inappropriate story regarding her poor neighbor's messy divorce. Uncle Robert was aggressively tearing into his third massive lobster tail, butter dripping down his chin. Chloe, who had apparently sprinted to the restroom and successfully reclaimed her forgotten phone, was back to mindlessly scrolling her social media feed, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that she had just handed me the nuclear launch codes to their entire operation. However, armed with the devastating truth, I began noticing subtle, damning details that I had either missed before or had subconsciously refused to let myself clearly see. My mother kept nervously shooting rapid, darting glances down the table at my dad's thick leather wallet sitting conspicuously next to his plate. She was making quick, anxious little flicks of her eyes, behaving exactly like a terrified technician desperately checking the ticking numbers on a bomb's countdown timer. My dad's booming laughter was consistently landing just half a nervous beat too loud. It was the specific, over-exaggerated way guilty people laugh when they are deeply anxious and subconsciously trying to cover up their mounting panic with aggressive volume. The expensive wine bottle, the second incredibly expensive bottle of the night, was nearly drained dry, and absolutely nobody at the table had even mildly suggested slowing down their rampant consumption. Because realistically, why in the world would they? They genuinely believed they weren't the ones paying for it. They firmly believed I was paying. That was the entire insidious point of this whole grand evening. I now understood that every single succulent lobster tail consumed, every single rich Wagyu slider devoured, and every heavy pour of that $400 Bordeaux was acting as just another heavy, expensive brick in the massive, suffocating wall they were actively building around me. They were aggressively trying to build the social wall so incredibly high that I couldn't possibly climb out of the financial trap without causing the massive, humiliating public scene that I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to avoid. Deciding to play their game, I intentionally started asking targeted questions. I kept my tone breezy and casual, the innocent kind of polite questions you naturally ask when you're simply catching up with family after 3 long years of distance. But internally, they were not casual questions at all. They were the lethal kind of questions you only ask when you already hold all the real answers in your hand, and you simply want to sit back and watch people squirm as they blatantly lie directly to your face. "So how's the new cafe doing, Chloe?" I asked brightly, keeping my eyes fixed on her face. Chloe's hand abruptly froze, her expensive wine glass stopping awkwardly halfway to her glossy mouth. "Oh," she stammered, visually thrown off guard by the direct attention. We closed it. The local market just really wasn't there for our concept." She aggressively spat the rehearsed words out fast, ripping through the sentence exactly like painfully pulling off a sticky bandage that she had spent hours practicing removing in the mirror. Oh, wow, that's too bad, I replied smoothly, projecting false sympathy. Exactly how long did the place manage to last? 11 months, she muttered, staring down at her plate. Sensing the mounting tension, Mom frantically jumped in to save her golden child before the awkward silence could fully settle over the table. But Chloe is actively exploring so many exciting other professional options right now. She just has so many incredible natural talents, Mom gushed defensively. I simply nodded, letting the silence stretch just a second too long. Then I slowly turned my crosshairs directly onto my father. And how is the contracting business doing these days, Dad? Are you still aggressively doing those massive commercial builds? Instantly, the muscles in my dad's jaw tightened visibly for half a frantic second. It was a microscopic, physical tell of intense stress that I had instinctively cataloged in him long before I was even old enough to legally drive a car. Well, I'm sort of between major projects right now, he lied smoothly, forcing a gruff chuckle. The economy's been incredibly tough on everyone lately. You know exactly how it is. Oh, I definitely knew how it was. I intimately knew because I had literally just read the desperate text message. The bank called again Thursday, glaring on his wife's stolen phone screen less than 10 minutes ago. I also knew because the massive, ugly dent in his aging truck was still glaringly visible in the parking lot. And I mostly knew because the proud, arrogant man who had just forcefully ordered 2 massive rounds of premium lobster and demanded an extra $400 bottle of wine was currently sitting directly across the table from me, aggressively performing the illusion of deep solvency in the exact same desperate, overly dramatic way that a terrible community theater actor tries to perform Shakespeare. His performance was loud, it was deeply committed, and it was entirely, pathetically unconvincing to absolutely anyone who has ever actually seen the real, genuine thing. I just politely nodded, maintaining my mask, and allowed them to continue talking and digging their own graves. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that desperate people will eagerly tell you absolutely everything about their lives when they secretly view you as their personal unlimited bank. Without much prompting, they freely complained to me about the massive home kitchen renovation they had tragically been forced to put on hold. They loudly lamented the luxurious summer vacation they had ultimately decided to skip this year. They continuously dropped heavy hints about how things at home have been just a little bit tight lately, but absolutely nothing we can't easily handle. Every single carefully crafted sentence they spoke was a crystal clear window into a financial house that I could now visibly see was fully engulfed in raging flames. Yet they were all stubbornly standing out on the front lawn, choking on the ash, desperately trying to convince me that the thick black smoke was just a fun neighborhood barbecue. As the dinner dragged on, the emotional pressure inevitably started actively building, escalating in the exact same insidious, toxic way it always operates within my family dynamics. It never arrived as a straightforward, honest, direct question. Instead, it moved like a dangerous, invisible underwater current. It consisted of a relentless barrage of tiny, seemingly innocuous comments that all aggressively pushed the conversation in the exact same calculated direction. Comments that were specifically designed to be just casual enough for them to plausibly deny any malicious intent, yet highly coordinated enough to effectively back me into a corner. Aunt Martha let out a heavy theatrical sigh and loudly announced to the room, "My goodness, it really must be so incredibly rewarding doing so exceptionally well for yourself financially like that. Some of the rest of us just aren't quite so incredibly lucky in life." Not wanting to miss out on the pile-on, Cousin Simon, a man I literally had not spoken a single word to since Barack Obama was serving his second term in office, eagerly chimed in with, "Yeah, Clara, you really solidly landed on your feet out there. That is seriously so awesome for you." Even Uncle Robert, a gruff man who historically communicates almost exclusively through confusing sports metaphors, managed to grunt out, "You really hit a massive home run out there in the business world, kid." Every single weaponized compliment was another heavy brick in the trap. Every single brick deliberately pointed in the exact same direction. "We know you have money. We clearly see it. And we are deliberately making sure to aggressively remind you of your extreme wealth right here, in front of 16 captive witnesses." My mother proudly orchestrated the entire psychological assault from her central position at the table, acting exactly like a master conductor who had flawlessly memorized a complex symphony score. She would give an encouraging nod to Martha. She would flash a bright, validating smile at Simon. She would place a gentle, restraining hand firmly on my dad's tense arm whenever he started to excitedly speak a little too soon. I had to admit, she was incredibly good at this. She had honestly always been incredibly good at this manipulation. When I was a naive child, I used to foolishly think that my mother was simply a wonderfully warm person who deeply enjoyed hosting large family gatherings. Now, staring through the matrix, I finally understood the terrifying truth. She was a ruthless, highly efficient project manager with a terrifying 20-year track record of successful emotional extortion, and her absolute biggest, most lucrative deliverable of the night was currently sitting quietly at the far end of the table, sipping her sparkling water. Eventually, the leather-bound dessert menus arrived at the table. Aunt Martha instantly ordered the expensive creme brulee without even briefly bothering to glance at the listed price. Chloe loudly demanded the decadent chocolate souffle, a highly complex dish which explicitly required a mandatory 20-minute kitchen lead time to properly bake. This specific timing requirement meant that she must have aggressively ordered the massive dessert long before I had even walked through the front doors of the restaurant. Of course she had. They were deliberately running up the final tab with the reckless, gleeful abandon that people only ever display when they are absolutely certain that someone else is going to be paying the massive bill. They ordered without a financial ceiling, completely without a shred of moral guilt, and absolutely without casting a single cautious glance at the pricing column located on the right side of the menu. My solitary glass of sparkling water was finally melting down to the bare ice cubes. Ultimately, it was Chloe who carelessly shattered the thin, polite surface of the evening's tension. By this late point in the night, she had heavily consumed at least 3 massive glasses of the strong Bordeaux. The alcohol had been more than enough to completely sand down whatever fragile, microscopic filter she normally managed to keep securely wedged between her impulsive brain and her loud mouth, a filter which, frankly, was never especially thick or reliable to begin with. She leaned heavily across the table, dangerously waving her sloshing wine glass in her hand, and grinned widely at me, exactly as though the two of us were secretly sharing a hilarious inside joke. "Relax, big sister," she slurred loudly, rolling her eyes. "It's literally just dinner. You can easily afford it." I slowly, deliberately set my icy water glass down onto the table. I locked my eyes onto hers. "Afford what exactly, Chloe?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "This," she scoffed. She grandly swept her arm, gesturing wildly at the absolute carnage of the table. She pointed to the mountain of empty seafood platters, the drained wine bottles, the 16 expensive place settings, and the incredibly complex creme brulee and chocolate souffle that were currently being meticulously prepared by a hard-working kitchen staff that had absolutely no idea they were unwittingly catering a coordinated mafia-style shakedown. "We explicitly ordered all the really good stuff tonight since you're treating us," she stated. She delivered the massive financial assumptions so casually, so brazenly. "Since I'm treating," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. I stared at her, letting the words hang heavily in the air like a suffocating cloud of smoke. She spoke exactly as though this massive financial commitment had already been formally settled in some corporate board meeting that I was conveniently never invited to attend, which, thanks to her stolen phone, I now knew for a literal fact that it had been. The entire 16-person table instantly went completely, terrifyingly quiet for about 3 agonizingly long seconds. Now, 3 seconds of silence doesn't honestly sound like a very long time when you read it on a page, but I promise you, it feels like an absolute eternity when you are the solitary target actively sitting in the dead center of it. Mom violently shot Chloe a panicked, furious look that violently telegraphed the message. "Too early, you idiot." Chloe just drunkenly shrugged her shoulders, looking mildly confused, reacting exactly like a clumsy person who had accidentally bumped into a priceless antique vase that she had absolutely no intention of bending down to pick up. Uncle Robert suddenly became incredibly, deeply fascinated by the empty lobster shell sitting on his dirty plate, studying it like it held the secrets of the universe. Aunt Martha suddenly found the intricate stitching on her cloth napkin to be the most visually fascinating thing she had ever seen. Dad loudly, nervously cleared his throat, attempting to break the suffocating tension. The heavy silence stretched out just long enough for Liam to bravely arrive at my side with a fresh, cold bottle of sparkling water, quietly placing it respectfully beside my empty glass. In that crystal clear moment, 2 profound realizations slammed into my brain. First, I sharply realized that this terrified young waiter, Liam, was literally the absolute only person in this entire massive room who had willingly poured me something tonight without secretly expecting to violently extract something massive from me in return. And second, I fully realized that my foolish sister had just arrogantly confirmed out loud exactly what every single person sitting in this private room already secretly knew to be the undeniable truth. I was the designated mark. This entire lavish family dinner was nothing more than an elaborate, coordinated heist. And every single discarded cracked lobster tail sitting on that table was tangible, undeniable forensic evidence of their crime. What spectacularly happened next was purely an accident of conversation, and to this day, I almost genuinely feel bad for cousin Beatrice regarding how violently her innocent question landed in the room. She was honestly just trying to make polite conversation to break the horrific tension, and I genuinely believe she meant well, primarily because Beatrice was literally the only family member who had bothered to send me a brief "thinking of you" birthday text during year 2 of my brutal exile, a tiny kindness that I had been too heartbroken to ever reply to, and which I still secretly felt guilty about ignoring. "So Clara," Beatrice nervously started, trying to sound upbeat, "Mom recently said you got a really big promotion at work? Something about you running a whole bunch of expensive restaurants now." I decided to keep my answer brutally simple and devoid of ego. "Yes," I stated plainly. "I am the regional operations director. I oversee 4 separate locations." Beatrice nodded her head enthusiastically, looking genuinely impressed by the title. "Wow, that is so amazing. So, you're totally in charge of all of them?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady and commanding. "I manage the staffing, I negotiate the vendor contracts, I ensure legal compliance, I handle the financials. I oversee absolutely everything, from the back-loading dock all the way to the final check. I delivered this comprehensive job description in the exact same flat, factual, unpolished tone that I would naturally use during a dry corporate board meeting. However, the simple word financials landed on that tense table like a massive, jagged rock thrown violently through a fragile glass window. Aunt Martha's fork instantly stopped moving midair. Uncle Robert's head slowly snapped up from his plate for the very first time in 10 solid minutes, his eyes narrowing. Chloe's endlessly scrolling thumb completely froze on her glowing screen. Even my dad noticeably shifted his physical weight in his large chair, visibly reevaluating the tactical situation, his mind frantically recalculating the odds. They obviously knew I was successful. They had aggressively built their entire elaborate evening strategy completely around the base assumption that I was wealthy enough to effortlessly pay this massive bill. But hearing the actual scope of my immense authority, hearing the specific granular details of what my demanding career actually entailed, was vastly different from just vaguely assuming I had a good job. In their ignorant, narrow minds, they had always just dismissively pictured me as an overpaid, glorified waitress who had somehow gotten incredibly lucky in life. They had absolutely not pictured a hardened corporate executive who could flawlessly read and analyze a complex profit and loss statement significantly faster than any of them could read a simple dessert menu. They hadn't realized I was a woman who routinely negotiated massive vendor contracts worth significantly more money than their actual houses. Most dangerously for them, they hadn't realized they were trying to run a scam on a woman who knew exactly, down to the absolute microscopic cent, exactly how much 16 plates of premium lobster tails and 2 bottles of vintage Grand Cru Bordeaux truly cost on the back end, long before the printed check ever physically arrived at the table. I could physically feel the entire table frantically recalibrating their strategy. It felt exactly like a sudden, severe drop in barometric pressure right before a massive thunderstorm hits. The ultimate power dynamic hadn't completely shifted yet, but the rigid locks holding it in place had suddenly, violently loosened. My dad, ever the tactician, strategically waited until the dessert course to launch his final assault. I will reluctantly give him credit for his timing. He was highly strategic about it. Chloe's massive chocolate souffle had finally arrived at the table. Aunt Martha's creme brulee sugar crust had been loudly cracked, and the empty second bottle of expensive Bordeaux was currently resting upside down in the silver ice bucket, a testament to their greed. The entire table was flushed, warm, completely stuffed, and moving slow, heavily sedated by a massive influx of sugar and strong wine. Every single face at the table was visibly soft, glowing with the incredibly specific, smug satisfaction that only ever comes from devouring a wildly expensive meal that you absolutely didn't pay for and never had any intention of funding. Slowly, dramatically, Dad deliberately set down his heavy silver fork. He meticulously folded his large hands together and rested them firmly on the absolute edge of the table. It was a highly calculated power gesture. It was the exact same intimidating physical posture I had watched him adopt countless times before, ruthlessly signing aggressive business contracts, before delivering arrogant windbag speeches at family Thanksgivings, and most notably, right before coldly telling 23-year-old me that he desperately needed me to be a co-signer on his truck loan just this once. He locked his cold eyes onto mine. He didn't look overtly unkind, nor did he look cartoonishly cruel. Instead, he wore the specific, deeply infuriating expression of a highly arrogant man who genuinely believes he is being entirely logical and perfectly reasonable in his demands. Clara, he started, his voice dripping with condescension as he flashed a patronizing smile. You're paying, right? You owe us that much. Those 5 words. You owe us that much. 16 people sat in dead silence and clearly heard him say those words. Liam, who was currently quietly refilling Aunt Martha's coffee mug just behind me, heard those words. An elderly, wealthy couple sitting at the adjacent table, aggressively pretending they weren't eagerly eavesdropping on our drama, clearly heard those words. As the demand settled over the room, my mother gave a firm, validating nod of agreement. My sister Chloe offered a cruel, satisfied smirk like she had just won a prize. My Aunt Martha calmly reached out and buttered another piece of bread, acting as though the intense financial matter was entirely, officially settled and closed. You owe us? They had brutally enforced 3 agonizing years of absolute silence, actively erasing me from their lives, and not one single person sitting at that massive table had offered an apology tonight. Not one person had admitted they were wrong to cut me off, nor had anyone sincerely stated that they had genuinely missed my presence for any reason whatsoever outside of my massive credit limit. You owe us that much. I sat there, staring directly at my father across a massive wooden table, completely covered in the disgusting wreckage of an extravagant meal that I had absolutely not ordered. I was hopelessly surrounded by a massive crowd of family members that I had deliberately not been told were coming. I was tightly holding on to a simple glass of water that I had quietly poured for myself. And in that specific, highly pressurized moment, I felt a singular, overwhelming emotion that I absolutely had not anticipated feeling when I walked in. I felt profound, beautiful relief. I felt relief because the terrifying, massive decision that I had been absolutely paralyzed with fear over making had just been incredibly easily made for me. I didn't rush to answer him right away. In my years of management, I have learned a very powerful weapon: silence. Total, unbroken silence does significantly more heavy lifting than words ever could when you are trapped in a room full of arrogant people who are entirely used to always being blindly agreed with. I let the silence stretch. 3 agonizing seconds, then 5 seconds. It was the specific suffocating kind of heavy silence that actively forces a massive table of 16 people to start nervously shifting their physical weight in their creaky chairs, frantically reaching for their water glasses to hide their mounting panic, suddenly pretending they have found something incredibly interesting to stare at on the blank restaurant wall directly behind my head. For 15 long, exhausting years, I had always blindly paid the bill, so that absolutely no one would ever have to suffer the embarrassment of making a public scene. I had obediently picked up every single restaurant check shoved my way. I had dutifully co-signed every single disastrous loan application they shoved in my face. I had reliably covered every single apartment security deposit, blindly paid every single expensive dental bill, and quietly funded every single exorbitant florist invoice, all because the terrifying emotional cost of simply saying the word no meant facing a hostile room looking exactly like this one. It meant facing a room completely full of staring, heavily expecting faces, bound together by the deeply unspoken toxic understanding that Clara's familial love was strictly measured in hard dollars, and that Clara's continued presence in the family was exclusively purchased through total financial compliance. 15 years of my life, thousands upon thousands of my hard-earned dollars drained, and the literal price of basic admission to remain in my own family had just been arrogantly announced to the entire room at roughly $80 a plate, plus the exorbitant cost of wine, plus the massive premium of lobster, plus the particular soul-crushing emotional tax that inherently comes with being the designated scapegoat child, who is only ever called upon when something massive desperately needs funding. I stared intensely at my father's large hands, which were still aggressively folded on the table, still projecting total, unbothered steadiness. I looked deeply into my mother's eyes, which were still projecting that fake, suffocating warmth, still actively performing her matriarchal role for the audience. I looked over at Claude, already arrogantly returned to mindlessly scrolling on her phone, entirely because, as far as her shallow mind was concerned, this financial transaction was already officially decided and closed. Finally, I looked over at Liam, who was quietly standing over by the wooden service station, intently watching our table with the careful, hyper-alert attention of a smart young man who instinctively knows that something incredibly important is about to explode at his table, even if he isn't entirely sure exactly what the bomb is yet. Then, I looked down at my simple glass of sparkling water. It was half full, and the delicate bubbles were beautifully catching the warm, flickering candlelight, looking exactly like a small, quiet, unbreakable promise that I had made to myself in my car earlier that evening. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up my cloth napkin and gently placed it down onto the messy table. I looked directly at my father and offered a chillingly serene smile. "Let me go take care of things," I said smoothly, and I calmly stood up from my chair. Instantly, the collective tension in the room evaporated. Mom let out a massive, dramatic exhale of relief. Aunt Martha theatrically patted her chest. Dad finally unfolded his tense hands, a smug look of total victory washing over his arrogant face. Every single one of those 16 people genuinely, fully believed that I was walking away to dutifully pay their massive bill. But here is the ultimate secret that 15 grueling years standing behind a chaotic host stand fiercely teaches you. The absolute person who physically controls the check is the person who controls the entire room. My toxic family arrogantly thought that they were in total control. They had meticulously set the trap. They had purposely chosen this extremely expensive restaurant. They had aggressively ordered the most expensive items on the menu. They had carefully assembled a massive audience to maximize the public pressure, and my father had flawlessly delivered the final demand. They were heavily armed with 16 people, 2 empty bottles of $400 wine, and 3 solid years of agonizing, built-up emotional pressure firmly on their side. But I was armed with 2 simple sentences and a smart waiter named Liam. I absolutely did not walk toward the front register located in the lobby. Instead, I purposefully walked directly toward the busy service station tucked away at the chaotic back of the dining room, where Liam was frantically organizing leather check presenters and a seasoned floor manager, whose brass name tag read Marcus, was intensely reviewing a complicated printed ticket. Marcus was wearing the standard authoritative uniform of high-end hospitality, a crisp black shirt, a sharp black tie, and a coiled clear earpiece firmly tucked into his ear. Most importantly, Marcus wore the distinct hardened look of a veteran man who had been surviving in this brutal industry long enough to effortlessly handle absolutely whatever chaotic nonsense walked up to him. I walked right up to him. "Excuse me, Marcus?" I asked politely. He immediately turned around, effortlessly flashing a flawless professional smile. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you this evening?" I deliberately kept my voice incredibly low. I wasn't being overly dramatic, nor was I acting wildly conspiratorial. I simply used the exact, specific volume and tone that you naturally use when you work in the industry, and you are efficiently handling a massive problem that absolutely does not require the entire dining room's attention. Liam was standing directly beside him, intensely listening, his tired eyes highly alert, balancing a heavy tray, perfectly on his hip. Both of these men looked at me in a very specific way. They looked at me the exact way that hardened restaurant professionals look at an outsider who suddenly, unexpectedly, speaks their secret language, with immediate, laser-focused, precise attention. Looking directly into Marcus's eyes, I calmly delivered two devastating sentences. I am not the host of that party, and I will absolutely not be covering that table's bill tonight. Please print the full unedited check and bring it directly to the gentleman sitting at the absolute head of the table, the older man whose credit card is already currently on file to hold the reservation. Marcus physically blinked once. He shot a rapid, calculating glance over at Liam, and then his eyes darted right back to me, processing the massive shift in dynamics. And the second thing? I continued smoothly, not missing a beat. I need you to completely split off just my single sparkling water onto a completely separate check. Once you run my card for the water, I want you to manually add a flat 30% gratuity onto my personal slip for your team here. You guys have more than earned it dealing with them tonight. Liam's exhausted eyes noticeably widened in shock. Marcus stood there and silently looked at me for 3 full calculating seconds. I could literally see his brain rapidly reading the intense situation, analyzing it the exact same way a truly phenomenal floor manager reads every potential disaster, incredibly fast, highly thorough, and absolutely without a single ounce of moral judgment. Then he simply gave a sharp, definitive nod. Done, he stated firmly. That was literally it. There was absolutely no pushback, no annoying argument, no hesitation, and certainly no patronizing. Are you absolutely sure about this, ma'am? Marcus had been working in this chaotic environment long enough to instantly recognize exactly what a calculated financial redirect looked like. And poor Liam had been painfully watching my family's horrific behavior all night long enough to fundamentally understand exactly why such a brutal redirect was desperately needed. I efficiently paid my tiny check right there on the spot at the terminal. The final bill was for 1 single sparkling water and 2 polite refills, plus a massive 30% cash tip that I knew would easily be the absolute largest gratuity Liam had likely received in over a month. Marcus efficiently ran my credit card, handed me my printed receipt, and leaned in to quietly whisper, I will personally present the main table's check in exactly 10 minutes, right after the dessert course is fully cleared away. Perfect, I replied. I confidently turned around, walked completely back to the massive table, calmly sat back down in my chair, picked up my icy water glass, and took a very slow, satisfying sip. The oblivious atmosphere at the table was nauseating. Chloe was loudly arguing with cousin Simon over the stupid plot of some trashy reality television show. Aunt Martha was aggressively leaning over to corner Uncle Robert, bitterly complaining about a trivial fence dispute she was currently having with her neighbor. My mom was quietly watching me with the deeply careful, smug attention of a manipulative woman who fully, confidently believes that the massive financial trap has been successfully sprung and handled. My dad was arrogantly leaning far back in his sturdy chair, his thick arms comfortably crossed over his chest, radiating total, unearned satisfaction. There were 16 people happily gorging themselves on expensive dessert, draining the absolute last, precious drops of a $400 bottle of wine, entirely waiting for a massive bill that they had absolutely no intention of ever seeing, let alone paying. I calmly set my crystal glass down on the table and simply waited with them. I can honestly tell you that those 10 specific minutes were easily the absolute most peaceful, serene minutes of my entire evening. The loud, obnoxious table obviously didn't know it yet, but this lavish meal was entirely over in every single way that actually mattered. The exorbitant food had been greedily eaten, the expensive wine was completely gone, the aggressive financial demand had been loudly made, and my final devastating answer had already been quietly delivered in a secret operational language that absolutely none of them were capable of speaking. I sat comfortably at my isolated end of the massive table and simply listened to the chaotic hum of my family talking. Aunt Martha loudly shifted her complaints to aggressively bemoan the rising cost of landscaping mulch. Uncle Robert started loudly telling a confusing, rambling fishing story that clearly had no actual point or ending. Chloe drunkenly held up her phone and snapped a series of vanity selfies, prominently featuring the remnants of her expensive chocolate souffle in the background to flex for her followers. At one point, Mom actually let out a loud, genuine laugh at something Cousin Beatrice said. It was a real, unforced laugh, the specific kind that deeply crinkled the soft corners of her eyes and miraculously made her sound for exactly 3 fleeting seconds, exactly like the warm woman who used to happily sing Dolly Parton songs while cooking in our old kitchen. For a brief second, I almost felt a dangerous pang of emotion. Almost. But then, I forced myself to look over at my dad. He was currently hiding his phone under the edge of the tablecloth, obsessively checking the screen with the tight-jawed, terrified focus of a desperate man who was actively waiting for a horrifying text message he absolutely didn't want to receive. And I violently remembered the cruel, calculating message I had just read on Chloe's phone. Clara can cover us through the spring. She's got more than enough. I looked back down at my glass. My sparkling water beautifully caught the ambient candlelight again. I silently sat there and watched the tiny carbonation bubbles rapidly rise to the surface and pop, one by one, each tiny explosion representing a microscopic implosion that absolutely nobody else at the loud table even noticed. I sat there and thought deeply about the naive 17-year-old version of Clara. I pictured her wearing a cheap stained apron, desperately trying to carry 4 scalding plates up her burned forearm, desperately learning how to force a polite smile through the searing physical pain in her burning shoulders. I knew exactly what that terrified young girl would have done tonight. That broken girl would have panicked and paid. That fragile girl would have immediately pulled out her emergency credit card, completely covered the massive cost of this entire horrific 16-top table, foolishly called the extortion love, and then she would have driven home alone just to violently cry in her shower, absolutely never telling a single soul about the abuse. But I was absolutely not that terrified little girl anymore. Right on cue, Liam appeared at the dark edge of the private alcove. Before he even took his first tentative step into the room, I knew exactly, with absolute certainty, whose specific chair he was purposefully walking toward. The room fell quiet as Liam approached the head of the table. With practiced precision, Liam placed the heavy leather-bound check presenter, beautifully embossed with the Grand Azure's elegant gold logo, directly onto the pristine tablecloth, planting it squarely in front of my father. He didn't place it politely in the neutral center of the table. He didn't place it anywhere near me at the far end. He placed it directly in front of Arthur Sterling, the arrogant man who had explicitly made the reservation, the man whose personal credit card was legally on file, the man who had loudly commanded the entire table to put it all on this just 2 hours ago. The loud, chaotic conversation at the table instantly died, extinguishing as rapidly as a weak candle caught in a sudden, violent draft. My dad sat completely frozen, staring down at the black leather folio for 2 full, agonizing seconds. I could literally see the gears in his brain violently grinding as he desperately tried to process the impossible error. His eyes telegraphed his panic. The check was supposed to go to Clara. The check was supposed to go to Clara. Why is the check sitting directly in front of me? Mom's eyes went incredibly, terrifyingly wide. She frantically looked over at me, then her panicked eyes darted down to the heavy check, and then she violently looked right back at me. And for the absolute first time all night, her flawless manufactured composure violently cracked, exposing the frantic, terrifying math rapidly running behind her eyes. "Clara," she started to say, her voice trembling slightly. But Dad managed to recover first. He was always incredibly good at recovering his mask. He had successfully spent 63 years on this earth, absolutely never, ever admitting out loud that he had been caught off guard or made a mistake. Forcing a confident smirk, he arrogantly picked up the leather check presenter, aggressively flipping it open with a casual, theatrical flick of his wrist, deliberately making sure he did not actually look down at the printed total. He literally couldn't afford to look at the total. If he actually looked at the astronomical total right now in front of 16 expectant people, his entire grand performance would instantly collapse. "I've got it," he loudly declared to the silent room, smoothly pulling his designated credit card from his worn wallet with the exact same arrogant two-finger magical flourish that he had aggressively used earlier in the evening. He forcefully shoved the plastic card into Liam's waiting hand, completely refusing to break his intense, hostile eye contact with me down the length of the table. "We're celebrating tonight, remember?" he barked aggressively. Liam politely took the card, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. "I'll be right back with you, sir," Liam replied. He delivered the line incredibly gently, using the specific, sympathetic tone that industry veterans only ever use when they know exactly the horrific disaster that is about to happen, and the arrogant person they are talking to remains blissfully unaware of their impending doom. My dad confidently leaned back into his heavy chair, smugly crossed his thick arms over his chest, and flashed me a victorious smile, radiating the absolute, delusional confidence of a desperate man who genuinely believed that his flimsy piece of plastic was actually going to miraculously save him from this trap. Exactly 4 minutes later, Liam silently reappeared. He walked purposefully back to the head of the table and stood directly beside my father's chair. He leaned down incredibly close and spoke. He spoke at a low volume that was clearly designed to be polite and discreet, but because the entire 16-person table had gone completely, terrifyingly silent, so utterly silent that you could literally hear the ice cubes melting in the water glasses, his words echoed like a gunshot. "I am so incredibly sorry, sir," Liam whispered clearly, "but the card has been declined." Absolutely nobody at the table dared to move a single muscle. My dad's smug, victorious smile remained frozen on his face for exactly one more torturous second. It was a pure physical reflex, exactly like a dying light bulb that stubbornly stays brightly lit for a split second after you have already violently flipped the switch off. Then the smile completely vanished. "Just run it again," he commanded, his voice tight and defensive. Liam gave a polite, professional nod. He silently disappeared back toward the kitchen. Exactly 2 minutes later, he returned. He assumed the exact same polite lean, using the exact same gentle, sympathetic voice. "I'm so sorry, sir. It is still strictly not going through," Liam informed him. "Would you perhaps like to try providing another card?" Panic finally flared in my dad's eyes as he frantically reached for his wallet. His trembling fingers aggressively tore through the tight leather slots. He pulled out one card. Then he frantically ripped out another. Finally, he managed to dig out a third, obscure card that was deeply hidden behind his driver's license, pulling it out with the sheer desperation of a man firing the absolute last hidden bullet in a chamber he had completely forgotten he had even loaded. He violently shoved it into Liam's hand. The table remained graveyard silent. 16 people. Not a single silver fork was moving. Absolutely no wine was being poured. There was no laughter left. The only sound in the entire expansive room was the pathetic rustling sound of Arthur Sterling's 63 years of massive pride being violently compressed into a cheap leather wallet that his shaking hands couldn't seem to close fast enough. When Liam inevitably came back for the third time, he didn't even need to speak a single word. The pitying expression on the young waiter's face loudly said it all. My dad stared blankly at Liam. Then slowly, his head swiveled, and he looked directly down the long table at me. He wasn't looking at me with blazing anger. Not yet, anyway. He looked at me with the incredibly raw, utterly unguarded, terrifying expression of a ruined man who has just horrifyingly realized, live, in front of absolutely every single person whose opinion actually matters to his fragile ego, that the massive financial safety net he had aggressively been counting on was completely gone. He realized the ground rushing up to meet him was exactly as hard and unforgiving as he had always deeply feared. He stared at me with the desperate, pleading look of a drowning man watching the absolute last lifeboat violently pull away from the sinking ship. I calmly reached out, picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, took one final deliberate sip, and set it firmly back down on the linen. I don't owe you, I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. I never did. My dad's heavy wooden chair suddenly scraped violently back against the polished hardwood floor, generating a horrific screeching sound that sounded exactly like thick paper being violently torn in half. Clara, he growled. His voice was incredibly low, desperately trying to remain controlled, but it was visibly shaking with rage at the absolute edges. What exactly did you do? I didn't do a single thing, Dad, I replied cleanly, maintaining unbreakable eye contact. Your credit card was declined. That is entirely a matter between you and your personal bank. You were supposed to... He aggressively started to yell, but he miraculously managed to stop himself, though not nearly fast enough. The damning half-finished sentence hung suspended in the dead air, wildly unfinished, yet glaringly visible to every single person in the room. You were supposed to pay. Suddenly, Mom started violently crying. And I don't mean the quiet, genuine kind of crying. I mean the highly performative, manipulative kind. It was the specific kind of theatrical crying that heavily involves loud gasps, aggressive dabbing of the eyes with a napkin, and projecting enough sheer volume to successfully recruit unwarranted sympathy from the wealthy strangers sitting at the adjacent tables. After absolutely everything we have done for you in this life, after I literally carried you in my womb, she wailed dramatically. How could you possibly just sit there and... What exactly did you do for me, Mom? I coldly interrupted, slicing right through her theatrics. My voice was dead level. I absolutely did not raise it to match her hysteria. I didn't even bother to lean forward in my chair. I simply stayed completely anchored in my seat, keeping both of my hands calmly wrapped around my cold water glass. Please, tell me, I challenged her quietly. Right here in front of absolutely everyone. What exactly did you do for me during the last 3 years? Beside her, Chloe violently slammed her flat palm down onto the table, making the silverware rattle. "This is just so typical of you," she screamed. "You always, always have to make absolutely everything about you." Aunt Martha frantically reached her hand out, trying to grab my arm again. "Clara, dear, please. Your poor father is clearly so deeply embarrassed right now. Can't you just—" "No." Just one single word. I delivered it in the exact same cold, authoritative tone that I would ruthlessly use to shut down a shady vendor who had arrogantly tried to short my warehouse delivery invoice. It was crystal clear, utterly final, and delivered absolutely without a single ounce of apology. And then, shockingly, Dad finally broke. It wasn't with blazing anger this time. It was with something significantly worse, something profoundly pathetic. The booming volume of his voice completely dropped out, and for one singular, terrible, incredibly honest moment, he genuinely sounded exactly like a terrified man standing alone in a dark house with all the lights permanently turned off. "Clara, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We're drowning." Looking at him in that moment, I finally saw him. I saw the terrified, pathetic man frantically hiding behind the loud performance. I saw the broken father who had completely lost his contracting business and all of his remaining pride. A man who was utterly incapable of admitting his catastrophic failures out loud until a plastic credit card literally forced him to do it publicly. I saw him, and for a split second my heart genuinely ached. But then he aggressively added, "And you'd just sit there and let us?" And just like that, the brief ache completely stopped. Because I violently realized that even while he was actively drowning, he was still ruthlessly reaching out to grab my wallet instead of trying to hold my hand. I finally stood up from the table. I didn't move fast, and I wasn't being overly dramatic about it. I stood up with the steady, calm posture of someone who has finally made their ultimate decision and absolutely does not need to ask the room for permission to leave. "Dad," I said firmly, looking down at him, "I'm genuinely sorry that you are struggling right now. I really mean that." I paused, sweeping my hand to gesture at the absolute wreckage on the table. I pointed at the towering empty seafood platters, the upside-down $400 wine bottles, and the 16 shocked faces that were currently staring up at me as though I were the wicked villain in a fairy tale they had spent all week rehearsing. But this is absolutely not asking for help. This is a trap. I looked directly at my mother. "You absolutely did not invite me here tonight to make amends with me." I looked back to him. "You invited me here to make a payment." Mom's performative crying suddenly shifted, hardening into something vicious and real. "That is so incredibly unfair, Clara," she hissed, dropping the victim act. "We just desperately wanted you back in this family." "You only wanted me back for exactly what bills I could cover, Mom," I shot back smoothly. "I read the group messages on Chloe's phone in the bathroom. Clara can cover us through the spring, isn't that right?" The entire table instantly went ghost white. All the color aggressively drained from Chloe's horrified face. Mom's trembling hand violently flew up to cover her gaping mouth in absolute shock. Dad just stared blankly down at the white tablecloth, entirely defeated. "If you ever want real help," I continued, my voice ringing with total finality, "if you need genuine help, I will happily sit down in a room with you and a licensed financial counselor, and we will properly figure out a realistic plan together." I stared them all down. No more stupid tricks, no more massive audiences, and absolutely no more expensive lobster. I grabbed my purse. But I am absolutely not paying this exorbitant bill tonight. I did not order any of this food. I looked at my parents. I wasn't even told about this massive party, and I do not owe this money to you. I don't owe you anything. I never did. Not a single person in that room dared to speak a word. I securely hoisted my purse onto my shoulder. I looked directly at my mother, and I delivered the absolute final sentence I would ever speak to her at that cursed table. You always constantly told me that family takes care of family. So why in the world was I the absolute only one who ever actually did? Without waiting for a response, I proudly turned my back and began the long walk toward the exit, striding past the terrified busser, marching past the stunned hostess, and finally pushing through those heavy glass doors with the polished brass handles. Just as I reached the coat check area, Liam suddenly caught up to me. "Ma'am?" he called out softly. He was gently holding out my printed receipt. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was incredibly quiet, but profoundly sincere. I gently reached out and touched his shoulder. "You're doing great," I told him again, meaning it more than ever. Then I walked out into the warm Thursday evening. The sprawling parking lot was incredibly quiet. The summer air was thick, and the loud cicadas were just starting to sing in the manicured landscaped trees that desperately tried to make the Grand Azure look like it actually belonged somewhere far more important than a basic suburban strip mall. I got into my car, left the engine completely off, rolled down the window, and simply sat there reading that little sticky note still firmly pressed to my steering wheel. One dinner, then home. I had survived the one dinner. Now it was time to go home. I calmly pulled my phone out of my purse and opened the dreaded family group chat. The notifications were already violently flooding in. It was a massive barrage from Mom, Aunt Martha, Chloe, and even distant cousins I hadn't heard from in years, all of them frantically typing at the exact same time. It was a chaotic cascade of angry exclamation points, wild accusations, and the specific toxic kind of blinding fury that only ever comes from guilty people who have just been spectacularly caught in their own trap. I didn't bother to read a single one of their pathetic messages. I simply scrolled all the way to the absolute bottom of the screen, firmly tapped Leave Group, and peacefully watched the tiny system notification pop up to confirm my ultimate freedom. Clara has left the chat. I gently set my phone down onto the empty passenger seat. I smoothly started the car's engine, and I began the long drive home enveloped in the exact same profound silence that I had driven there in. Except this time, the heavy silence wasn't nervous or suffocating. This time, the beautiful silence entirely belonged to me. The ensuing aftermath of that explosive dinner was surprisingly much quieter than I had originally expected. Absolutely no one from the family dared to call me that night, nor did they call the next day, or even the day after that. The toxic group chat that I had finally abandoned simply continued to rage on without my participation. I only know this because cousin Beatrice, the exact same cousin who had sent the sweet birthday text, bravely reached out to me separately about a week later. "I just desperately wanted you to know," she wrote in a long text, "that what you did was easily the absolute most honest thing anyone has ever done at a family dinner in over 20 years. I am so deeply sorry that I was a part of it." Beatrice was the absolute only person in the entire family who ever apologized to me. Exactly 3 weeks later, my sister Chloe finally texted me. It absolutely wasn't to offer an apology. Incredibly, she texted to ask if I could possibly lend her the money to cover the first and last month's rent for a brand new apartment lease. I coldly replied by sending her the direct contact information for a local financial counseling service, politely wished her well, and never heard back. She completely ignored the message. Through my sporadic conversations with Beatrice, I slowly learned the devastating rest of the story in tiny pieces over the following grueling months. My dad's once proud contracting business had actually entirely folded a full 18 months before the disastrous dinner at the Grand Azure. He had apparently made several massive bad financial bets on 2 large commercial projects that had gone completely sideways. In a desperate bid to hide the failure, Mom had secretly been covering the bare minimum monthly payments on 4 maxed-out credit cards by violently draining a home equity line of credit that was now completely, irrevocably maxed out. Their large, beautiful family house was eventually forced onto the market that July. They were humiliatingly forced to pack up and move into a significantly smaller rental property located in a cheaper town 30 minutes south. Even Chloe was eventually forced to take a mundane, entry-level job, answering phones at a local dentist's office just to survive. I can honestly say that none of this suffering was what I had ever actually wanted for them. However, all of it was the direct, unavoidable consequence of the terrible choices they had continuously made long before I ever walked through the doors of the Grand Azure, and absolutely none of their massive catastrophe was my responsibility to fix. I firmly stuck to the boundary I had established. I did exactly what I had solemnly promised at that table. Exactly 6 weeks after the dinner, I picked up the phone, called my dad, and genuinely offered to sit down in a room with him and a professional financial counselor to help him dig out of his mess. He immediately hung up the phone on me. I absolutely haven't called him again since that day. But technically, the genuine offer still stands. Through this entire painful ordeal, I deeply learned that the absolute most expensive bankrupting thing you can possibly buy in this life is other people's comfortable complacency built purely on your own forced silence. And the exact night that I finally stood up, walked away, and stopped paying for their toxic comfort was the exact night that I finally, truly became rich. That is my final story. It is a story of 16 demanding seats, 1 solitary glass of sparkling water, and 1 plastic credit card that ultimately told the brutal truth that absolutely nobody else in the room was brave enough to admit. If you are currently out there and you have ever been treated as the designated family bank, please deeply hear my words. Helping others is always supposed to be a voluntary choice, absolutely not a mandatory debt. And a firm boundary absolutely doesn't have to be violently loud to be completely unbreakable. Please share this exact story with anyone who desperately needs to hear it right now. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.